Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to the second of the Seadrift poems, As I Ebb'd with the Ocean of Life. Some argue this is an epilogue of a kind to Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking, the poem that we've just recently worked with. Some call this Walt Whitman's most important, or one of the most important poems. Certainly we're going to see a much different kind of poem. I think I said to you guys in the last lecture that Out of the Cradle was different from anything that happens in Leaves of Grass. I could make the argument that we're going to see something different here as well, although I'll try to point out that you're going to see some comparisons here. First of all, between what we just did with Cradle and as well a poem that we've already done, like Brooklyn Ferry. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Now, that left-hand side, Talks with Walt, is what we call our playlist. Everything from Inscriptions on. In fact, we're going to reference several of those very early poems in Inscriptions, and when you pick up Ebb'd, you're going to see that there's some resonances, some echoes there. We have given an introductory set of comments to Seadrift that I recommend that you be looking at, and obviously our hope is that you've already messed with Cradle. We'll go to Norton's, as we always do, to talk a little bit about what the introductory set of comments here are. So let's hear what Norton's has to say to us about this poem, Ebb'd. It begins this way: probably composed in 1859, first published as Bardic Symbols in the Atlantic Monthly, April 1860. In Leaves of Grass, it appeared as number 1 of the Leaves of Grass, with the restoration of lines 59 through 60, whose realism had caused editor James Russell Lowell, we'll get to these lines, to request their omission from the magazine in which Walt Whitman was so eager to appear that he uncharacteristically acceded. We'll talk about this in a moment. In Leaves of Grass 1867, the title restated the first line, Elemental Drifts, later dropped. It was so called in the cluster Seashore Memories of Passage to India 1871 and 76, and was given its present title and position in 1881. And the manuscript was printed with variants show persistent though minor revisions. The poem, to continue now with Norton's, is remarkable in its poignant admission of self-doubt and frustration. So I would write that down right away at 2A already to see. In the period of its composition, Whitman, having left his editorial post on the Brooklyn Times, was unemployed and insecure, yet the mood of this poem is not that of personal discontent so much as recognition of the quote-unquote tears of things, end quote, in the human condition. That is to say, our theodicy question in our Big Five, right? It's not that the poet alone who identifies with himself with the sands and drifts, who seeks the consolation of the Father, who at the end is thrown helpless on the shore like a drowned corpse. It is humankind. Other poems, for example, On the Beach at Night, make their answer. Now, just pointing out some comparisons that have been made by any number of scholars between Out of the Cradle and Ebb'd and Flow. Out of the Cradle is about mothers, it's about oceans, it's about poetry, it's about love, it's about commitment, while Ebb'd and Flow with Life is about fathers, it's about shore, it's about failure of poetry, it's about personal inadequacy and profound uncertainty. Now, this is a challenging, I would say, and a very difficult poem to read for a lot of artists, because it speaks directly to the question of what do you do when you're growing uncertain about your ability as an artist. By the way, just to remind, the word ocean gets used for the first time in the Cabin Ships at Sea, which is right there at the beginning with Inscriptions. We already gave full work with this one. And you'll remember that line, this is Ocean's poem, and so we're going to be playing a similar kind of game. We'll begin, first of all, with the word ebbed. Only time it gets used is in this poem. Interesting. And we're going to get 9 ases in this poem. As I ebbed with the ocean of life, as I winded the shores, by the way, only use of winded in all of Leaves of Grass, the shores I know, as I walked where the ripples continually wash you, Paumanok. We know about Paumanok from, of course, a number of early poems, starting from Paumanok, the first time it gets mentioned, where they wrestle up horse and sibilant. We'll see this word sibilant one more time in Whispers of Heavenly Death. Where the fierce old mother, you'll remember it was the old crone at the conclusion of Cradle, right? Where the fierce old mother endlessly cries for her castaways. This idea of crying and tears is central to a lot of the poems in Seadrift, but certainly in this poem. I, musing late in the autumn day, musing's going to be an important part of Leaves of Grass, and certainly in this poem. Gazing off southward, held by this electric self, I sing the body electric comes to mind, out of the pride of which I utter poems. We're going to get to this pride and arrogant idea here in a second. Was seized by the Spirit. You'll remember in Broadway Pageant 2, this word seized got used, that trails in the lines underfoot. This idea of lines is, of course, going to be, and I've said this to you guys, I think Whitman is having a lot of fun in these poems. You remember in the earlier poem, Cradle, it was the undertone versus undertow. Here, notice, of course, it's lines. Poetic lines are going to be challenged here, but here, of course, it's just the lines on the sand itself, right? The rim, the sediment that stands for all the water and all the land of the globe, that is to say, representation. Later, we're going to see this as likeness at the conclusion of passage 1. Fascinated, and this makes so much sense, right, for our study of Whitman. My eyes reverting from the south, dropped to follow, it's going to be drooped and dropped, right? To follow those slender windrows, and then chaff, straw, splinters of wood, weeds, and the sleek sea gluten, scum, scales from shining rocks, leaves of salt lettuce, of course, leaves makes us smile, left by the tide. Again, there's a reason why in my intro to Sea Drifts, I read the passage that I read from T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, Dry Salvages, where he lists all those different kinds of elements that get left on the shore. And in other words, he's out walking, he's on the beach, he's looking down, he's seeing all this stuff there. And then he finishes. Miles, and again, it's a four-part poem, first part. Miles walking, the sound of breaking waves, the other side of me, Paumanok there, and then, as I thought, the old thought of likeness. And Norton's will have something to say about this idea of likeness, the correspondence in transcendental terms between the washed-up drift and the poet himself. These you presented to me, you fish-shaped island. There's going to be a lot said about the fact that several times Whitman is interested in the shape of Paumanok, and of course it has phallic shape as well, and there's been a whole lot said about that. We're back to more ases here. As I wended the shores I know, as I walked with that electric self, seeking types. Now, you'll maybe remember in Song of Myself, passage 32, that he talks about tokens of myself, that is to say, representation. And then we move to passage number 2. Now, I want to remind you, in passage number 2 of Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. Now, I'm gonna try to restrain some of what I'm gonna do here and not read too much of this. But do you remember how he talks in passage 6 of Crossing Brooklyn Ferry? It's not upon you alone the dark patches fall. The dark threw its patches down upon me also. The best I had done seemed to me blank and suspicious. My great thoughts, as I supposed them, were they not in reality mirage and meager? I'm sorry, meager, not mirage, meager. Nor is it you alone who know what it is to be evil. I am he who knew what it was to be evil. I too knitted the old knot of contrariety, blabbed, blushed, resented, lied, stole, grudged, had guile, anger, lust, hot wishes I dared not speak, was wayward, vain, greedy, shallow, sly, cowardly, malignant, the wolf, the snake, the hog, not wanting in me, the cheating look, the frivolous word, the adulterous wish, not wanting, refusals, hates, postponements, meanness, laziness, none of these wanting, was one with the rest, the days and haps of the rest, was called by my nightest name by clear loud voices of young men as they saw me approaching or passing, felt their arms on my neck as I stood, or the negligent leaning of their flesh against me as I sat. And that confessional poetry now married to what we're about to read. As I went to the shores, I know not. As I listened to the dirge, the voices of men and women racked. As I inhale the impalpable breezes that set in upon me. As the ocean, so mysterious, rolls toward me closer and closer. I too, we're going to get 5 of these I twos, by the way, which will obviously take us to Langston Hughes' classic I too, that we've already given comments and lectures on it, learnstrong.net. I too, but signify, back to types, at the utmost, a little washed up drift. Of course, sea drift is the title of this. A few sands and dead leaves to gather. By the way, notice it isn't together, it's to space gather. He's having fun here. Obviously, leaves he's having fun with. Gather and merge myself as part of the sands and drift. We're going to get more of this in passage 3 in a bit. Oh, baffled, balked. Again, back to this notion of drooping, right? Bent to the very earth, oppressed with myself that I have dared to open my mouth. You'll remember this idea of daring, right? We've heard this already a number of times. Brooklyn Ferry, passage 6 comes immediately to mind. Aware now that amid all that blab, go back to Song of Myself, passage 52, and Barbaric Yop, right? And then the lines we just read from Brooklyn Ferry, whose echoes recoil upon me. Again, echoes, I believe that T.S. Eliot learned to use this word poetically in 4 quartets from his Walt Whitman study. My words echo thus in your mind, Bert Norton 1. Blab, whose echoes recoil upon me, I have not once had the least idea who or what I am. We're back again to the reading of that we just gave you of Brooklyn Ferry. But that before all my arrogant poems, the real me stands yet. Hey, go back and look at his use of the word arrogant in Song of Myself, passage 40. We've already addressed it. And notice that the word me here is capitalized. The real me stands yet. Untouched, untold, altogether unreached. In other words, what are we saying? We are saying that there's no way to understand the real me. By the way, a construction that only gets used one time in all Weeds of Grass. It's right here, the real me. Withdrawn far, mocking me with mock congratulatory signs and bows, with peals of distant ironical laughter at every word I've written, pointing in silence to these songs and then to the sand beneath. Well, here we go. This is going to be a poem about how bad his poetry is, reminding us, of course, of Shakespeare and several of his lines as well. I perceive I have not really understood anything. And of course, this was always Whitman's central quest, was to understand. That is to say, things that are translinguistic. Not a single object, and that no man ever can. You remember earlier when he said, don't even try and write biographies of me because you can't figure me out. Then using and sounding a word very much like his friend Emerson. Nature here in sight of the sea, taking advantage of me to dart upon me and sting me because I have dared, again, back to that word, to open my mouth to sing at all. By the way, this word dare, I think T.S. Eliot learned this word and how to use this word, and there it is in the love song of Geoffrey Prufrock, do I dare disturb the universe? And then to passage 3, you oceans both, I close with you, we murmur alike. By the way, the last line of section 3, we'll come back to this murmur, so pay attention to it. We murmur alike reproachfully, rolling sands and drift, knowing not why. These little shreds, indeed, standing for you and me and all. Again, we're back to this notion of representation. You, friable shore, only use of the word friable, easily crumbled, right? Friable shore with trails of debris. Earlier it was lines, now it's trails. You fish-shaped island, I take what is underfoot. What is yours is mine, my father. Now in the Out of Cradle Intimacy Rocking, of course, we're going to talk about the ocean as mother. Here we're going to begin to talk about the ocean as father. And again, fish-shaped could obviously as well be interpreted as phallus-shaped, no question. I too, Pomanak. I too have bubbled up, floated the measureless float. We're obviously reminding ourselves of how float gets used in passage 9 of Brooklyn Ferry, the eternal float of solution. In passage 5 of Brooklyn Ferry, the float is going to be the static idea of static float. Here, notice it's going to be a floating like open road. Passage 6, in the float at the side of things. The measureless float have been washed on your shores. I too am but a trail of drift and debris. You'll remember in Song of Myself, passage 33, the debris buried me, right? I too leave little wrecks upon you, you fish-shaped island. I throw myself upon your breast, my father. Now, Norton's will have something interesting to say about this, my father. Paumanok, the island, his natal land, is here the father symbol, as the ocean is the fierce old mother. By the way, only use in all of Leaves of Grass, I throw myself. I cling to you. I told you guys about his grasping, holding, hand, this kind of thing. I cling to you so that you cannot unloose me. By the way, the great biographer Paul Zweig has pointed out that in an odd way, father and failure often are understood together for Walt Whitman. I hold you so firm till you answer me something. Remember, this answer happened in Out of the Cradle, Endlessly Rocky. And then, kiss me, my father. Are you ready for this? The only time kiss me is constructed, as a construction is used in Leaves of Grass, is right here. Kiss me, my father. Touch me with your lips as I touch those I love. Breathe to me while I hold you close. The secret of the murmuring I envy. By the way, this touch me, you'll maybe remember in the poem, as Adam early in the morning, be not afraid of my body. Touch me, be not afraid of my body, you'll remember. Now, as we've said in other lectures, Whitman and his father had a very complicated relationship, right, as he tried to understand and watch his father. Now, to passage 4, go back and read Brooklyn Ferry, passage number 9, and the direct address. Now we're going to get something very similar, and some will call this Whitman's greatest poetic crisis. Ebb, ocean of life, then the parenthetics, the flow will return. Cease not your moaning, you fierce old mother. Endlessly cry for your castaways, but fear not, deny not me. Rustle not up so hoarse and angry against my feet as I touch you or gather from you. This idea of gathering we'll get to in a moment. I mean tenderly by you and all. You remember tenderly? Well, I used it curling grass and Song of Myself 6. I gather from myself and for this phantom. Go back to the very beginning. Some of you are going, wait, there's an echo of phantom. Yeah, you're right. As I pondered in silence, the second poem in all of Leaves of Grass plays the game of phantom. Looking down where we led and following me and mine, and then he uses the me and mine construction again. Loose windrows, back to lines, right? Little corpses. And then this is the set of lines coming that were excised, right, from the very beginning because they were so dangerous. The way Norton says it is, this and the following lines are excised by James Russell Lowell, the editor of the Atlantic Monthly, just because they're so questionable. Whitman, as a corpse, as a complete and total failure as an artist, he says it this way: me and mine, loose windrows, little corpses, froth, snowy white and bubbles, and then in parenthetics, see from my dead lips the ooze exuding at last, see the prismatic colors glistening and rolling. Prismatic only used one time in Leaves of Grass here, end quote. Tufts of straw, sands, fragments, we're going to use this word fragments in Song of Prudence, buoyed hither from many moods, one contradicting another. Do you remember in Song of Myself 51, do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. From the storm, the long calm, the darkness, the swell, four things, musing, pondering, a breath, a briny tear. Next poem we're going to address is called Tears. A dab of liquid or soil, up just as much out of fathomless workings, fermented and thrown. A limp blossom, in Cradle it was drooped, right? Torn just as much over waves floating, drifted at random, of course, sea drift. Just as much for us that sobbing dirge of nature, notice capitalized nature. Just as much whence we come, that blare of the cold trumpets. By the way, did you notice the use of the word we here? In other words, he's moving from the individual to humanity. We, capricious, brought hither, we know not whence, spread out before you, you up there walking or sitting. It's an amazing way to connect with the reader. In other words, he's literally talking to you as you are reading Leaves of Grass, you up there walking or sitting. We saw this obviously in Brooklyn Ferry as well. Whoever you are, we too lie in drifts at your feet. Compelling set of lines that does what at 2A? Well, it does. It points out that even the greatest, the most amazing of artists sometimes engage in a whole lot of self-doubt. At 2B, The powerful symbolism of a corpse is radical for its day, so radical that the great editor Lowell said, no, we can't do it. And notice the lugubrious or sad or mournful tone here. Very unusual. That is to say, I share the sunny side of life, he says, and yet here, notice, it's pretty mournful tone. I've mentioned at 3A T.S. Eliot's Dry South Ages. I want to point out Tennyson's in memoriam poems. We've given a number of lectures over this one at LearnStrong.net. I think that Whitman understood the power of mournful poetry. Finally, at 3B, to own a poem like this, when was the last time that you struggled with self-doubt? And to that degree, our chats here, our talks with Walt, bring us to some kind of unity there as well. I hope you're being challenged by these poems. Thank you.